morning. Good morning. Hope everyone is well this morning. Good to have a good number here. If you are with us via YouTube, we're also glad that you are joining us this morning for our Bible study. I've asked Brother Chuck Ardema if he would to lead us in a prayer before we get started.
Dear Father, thank you this morning for this time we can spend. Thank you for this class, for David, his preparation. Father, thank you for the book that we can study and how we can learn of you and of your Son. Please help us, Father, to be attentive this day, pay attention, think about Esther, think about the lessons that we see there, and to gain in our faith and gain in our knowledge about you and about your word, and to gain in our obedience. Thank you so much for all you do for us. Please be with us during this hour. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
One thing I really like about this class, among other things, is that we have people that are very knowledgeable and will point out in a kind way when I've made a mistake. So let me just mention something to you that I mentioned last week that is not biblically based. I made the comment last week, and I was corrected by a fine young man. I won't call his name, he may not want me to, that I may have read something out of context. If you remember, I said that the queen, Vashti, was required to go, and she was required to go in front of the king and his men. At least that's what he commanded her to do. And I made the comment to go out and to dance provocatively, probably with very few clothes on. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible tells us that he told her to come before these men wearing her crown. Now, I talked to my source, Wayne Langford, as I always do. I go to Wayne for biblical questions, and he said, you're not going to find it in the Bible, but he said, historians tell us that chances are that's why she refused to do so. There had to be a level of embarrassment that she would not want to do so. But I just wanted to clear that up. I didn't want to throw my opinions in. So that's biblically what it says, that he asked her to appear before the other men with a crown. So let's do a real quick summary. Last week we got into the book of Esther, and we know there was a king that was just not really a very good king, preparing himself and his men for a long battle, and they did so by having a 6-month party. During this party, they all got very drunk and made some very poor decisions. One decision was for him to ask his queen to dance. She refused. At that point, he said, you're no longer my queen. And that's kind of where we left off. So we're going to start with chapter 2 this morning. Esther chapter 2. And let's just kind of see what's going on. Before we do that, Brian, let me do this real quick. Introduction to chapter 2. You want to read that from me, Brian, please? Can you read that from there?
Sure. It is important to know what happened in history between chapters 1 and 2 of Esther. Verse 16 of this chapter tells us that Esther became queen in Xerxes' 7th year. And since the feast in the last chapter was in his 3rd year, we need to understand that we have a time lapse of around 4 years between the two chapters.
Okay, one other thing before we read verse 1, I'm just going to read something that I found I thought was interesting, historical. It is highly probable and backed up by historians that Ahasuerus or Xerxes set out to conquer Greece during these 4 years. His efforts were a total failure. He returned home in disgrace. His army was defeated, and he lost many ships to a fleet much smaller than his own. He had 1,400 ships that were unable to overcome 350 Greek ships in the Battle of Salamis. He came back as a total failure, as a warrior, and showed his frustrations per Herodotus, a Greek historian, by consoling himself with sensual indulgences with his harem. After his return from Greece, again, he was a historian and a geographer from the Greek city of whatever that is. Again, history backs up what the Bible says. Even the Greek historian made the comment that he was consoling himself with sensual indulgences. And we're going to see that in this chapter. Jeff.
You know, this is, if you go back to Daniel and the statue, where he was talking about the different, each metal represented a different empire. And that first one was that Babylonian empire, and then that was going to give way to the Medo-Persian empire, which is this empire. And this is interesting. We see them fighting with Greece because Greece defeated the I believe, if I've got it all right, they defeated the Medo-Persians, and then the Greek Empire came into world domination. And then, of course, the Romans is what we read about in the New Testament. But I just wanted to point out, because this is where I think you're starting to see the beginning of that shift, because they've attacked Greece. And I'm sure Greece didn't like it and figured, we'll put our guys together and we'll attack you. But you see that shift starting right here at this time.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Brian, let's read before we get started. Go ahead, Win.
One thing, back years ago, I was into watching these History Channel things on ancient battles and stuff. And if you look at this whole campaign that, Xerxes did against Greece, I mean, it's really fascinating because everything points to that, there's lots of strategies and, there's battles that, if you're into that thing, that Battle of Thermopylae and stuff like that, where it's sort of become legend now of his battle between the Persians and the Greeks during this time. But as Jeff was sort of mentioning, one of the things that came out of it was during this time when he was, as a result of his battles against Greece, a certain person came up on the Greek side, after this, named Alexander the Great, So as a result of basically what Xerxes did in attacking Greece is how we get Alexander the Great just a short time later.
Okay. Very good. Good history lessons. Verse 1, Brian, chapter 2 of Esther.
And I'll be reading a New American Standard.
Okay.
If that's okay. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom."
Hey, Brian, just verse 1.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Read verse 1 again. Let's get our thoughts back on it.
After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her.
It's been 4 years, a harsh battle. You just have to wonder. I can't get into his head any better than you can, but you got to wonder what the king was thinking. Did I really make a mistake? I don't have a queen to come home to. I don't know the answer, but it's interesting that it said that he certainly was thinking about her. According to history, again, he tried to use sexual pleasure as a substitute for inner peace, but had not had accomplished and had not succeeded with that. So then he thinks of Vashti. The inference here is that now that his wrath had subsided, he remembered her. But what did we say about the decree that was written and signed? Couldn't be changed. So what was done was done. Also remember that she had borne him a child while he was gone to fight with Greece. So there was a tie there. Historians tell us that she was with child when all this took place, possibly. And so it's a really good possibility that he was also having to avoid his relationship with his son, which again it would be a tie that would be tough not to have a part of. 2 through 4, Brian.
Then the king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to Susa, the capital, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly.
The first note that I made is, I don't know how you could call these people advisors. That's the advice that they gave to the king. Is just go out and find a bunch of women that have no choice in the matter. You go in and you tell mom and daddy, I'm taking your daughter with me. And what I think we need to do sometimes that we don't do is slip our feet in the shoes of that father who he was told, your daughter will come with me. We don't know the ages of those daughters. We can probably assume they were very young. But they had no say-so. Now, we also can probably see possibly some parents who would think, well, this is a great thing because it could be our daughter may be a queen. So the odds would be very slim. But again, I just think it's important that we read over these things sometimes and shade over these things. If we were the parents of these children that these men were coming, saying, you're going to come with us and you're going to sleep with the king to see if you are what he wants, I would think it'd be really tough. Now, we mentioned that there were 127 provinces, kind of like our 50 states. And we assumed that maybe there were at least possibly 2 women that were selected from each area. So that'd be probably maybe around 200 innocent women, young ladies, for this dirty old man to choose from. I think that's probably the right words to use. We understand that after these young ladies were taken advantage of, if they were not selected as the next queen, they were most likely sent to his harem as one of his concubines. They would never be able to marry, and they would not have children unless it was okayed by the king. They would be his property, and they would be treated no better than dogs. Of course, a concubine was a female slave who functioned as a secondary wife and a surrogate mother. Haggai, which was mentioned, he was just, I can almost picture him as being one of these people that loved fashion. Because he's the one that's responsible to make sure that the ladies were prepared for their one-night stand with the king. And now the plan was going to be put into action. I think we've got some people that have some comments. I don't know who's first.
Yeah, I think you answered what I was wondering, but I was going to say, basically, once the girl had been through that process, with the king, even if he cut her loose and said, okay, you can go back home, I think in that time, in that culture, no man would want her just because of that. So I was thinking kind of what you were saying. He's basically ruined their life, any way you look at it.
Yeah. And the odds are 1 out of whatever number of women would be the odds of you being selected as that queen. So the odds were not in your favor for sure. Was there anybody else had a comment? Anything else through verse 4? 5 through 7, Brian.
Now there was a Jew in Susa, the capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. You sit through 7.
Please.
And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
Now we have 2 of the main characters coming into play here. We have Mordecai and we have Esther. What's the relationship between Mordecai and Esther? He was what? His uncle. But what does it say he treated her as? His daughter. She was like a daughter to him. You can put the label uncle on somebody, but if they are the ones that raised that child, then he looks at her as being a daughter. We later find also that Mordecai was at the gate, and many times people at the gate were people that had power. They had risen to some type of political position, so it could be that Mordecai was well known. And actually, when he talks about coming out of exile, the deportation happened about 100 years earlier, so it would have meant Mordecai's parents and grandparents that were being referred to here. Remember, God had punished the Jews for the disobedience and intermarrying with foreigners and allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take the city of Jerusalem and deport most of the Jews there. So Mordecai and Esther were related. He raised her after her parents died. And it also gives a description of her. What does it say about her? Yeah, pretty lady, fair and beautiful. So she would have been easy on a man's eyes. Yes, Wynn?
Oh, one thing to note about Mordecai also is, when they give his lineage, he's a Benjamite, and they say he's the son of Kish. Kish was Saul's father. So, there's possible relation between Mordecai and, the first king of Israel.
Very interesting. Okay, very good. Any other comments? This class is full of knowledge. Don't hesitate to share it. Verses 8 through 11. Brian?
So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to Susa the capital into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best palace in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. And every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared.
Read verse 9 again.
Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with her cosmetics
Okay,
and...
stop there. Thank you. The King James Version, I think maybe a better translation, it says they prepared her for purification. We'll talk about what that means here in just a second, but I just wanted to mention that. Okay, first of all, remember that Haggai was the person responsible for these young women. He was the one that had around 200 women that he obviously had to assign different duties to men and women to help them prepare. In verse 9, though, it says that he favored Esther. It may be because she was fair and beautiful, but it also would make you wonder how cooperative maybe that she may have been. But he moved her ahead of others so that she got her turn with the king sooner. She even had 7 maidens that she could call on, which is very unusual, I would think. She was kind of moved into what I would consider the penthouse area of the castle, of the palace, so to speak. And it goes back to here we go again. It's not what you know; it's who you know. And Haggai was the person responsible, and so he made sure that she got moved ahead. In verse 10, we find out that Esther had been very careful to make sure that no one knew she was a Jew. Why would that be? If I'm in a foreign country and are there some areas in the world where it would be better that people not know I'm an American? Same thing here. Jews were mistreated. So to protect her, Mordecai said, don't let people know that you are a Jew. Very important that you do that.
David?
So he was, just one second, Jim. I'll call you just one second. Verse 11, why was he concerned? Because again, he knew if she was not selected, she would be returned to the house of women and would be a concubine. Yes, sir, Mr. Jim.
We've already discussed this possibility, and probably it was the truth. All this was done in God's control. You take Joseph, how the whole family of Israel, if you want to say, the family of God or the chosen people were chosen. God had his hand on this, and I think that's what's taking place here.
Yes.
She got fair treatment there due to the fact that God had a hand in causing all this.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I think hopefully one of the first things I said when we started this class is we see God's providence throughout this book, even though the word God is never used. I was talking to Miss Liz before class. We talked about comparing it to Ruth. Look at all the providential things that we see in the book of Ruth. Well, throughout the Bible, of course. But we sure see God's providence working in this. That's a good point, Jim. Verses 12 through 15.
Now when the turn of each young lady came to go in to King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go in to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go in to the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the son of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go in to the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her.
Okay, back in verse 12, I think the better translation is purification. What would that mean? Well, number one, the purpose of purification or beautification, number one, to become as physically attractive as possible. And again, that's where the myrrh, cosmetics, hair, their weight, etc., those things would be looked at. But the second one is just as important, was to make sure that none of these women were with child. There's a 6-month period there. The last thing that the king would have wanted was a young lady that was not showing yet, so to speak, and they were with child. Verse 13, can you just imagine some of the things that he had these young ladies to wear to impress the king? That was his job. Why is he having the women coming to him? It's certainly not to pat him on the back. Their job was to seduce the king. Their job was to make sure that the king found more favorable with them than any of the other around 200 women. So that was he had a job to take care of, and those poor ladies had no choice. And here's the thing that really is saddening to me. In the evening, and this wasn't just talking about Esther in this case, it's talking about the young ladies. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned. Where'd she return to? She returned back to where all the other women were. In the evening she went to see the king, and the morrow she returned. And again, remember that it wasn't by their own decisions that these things were taking place. It's just a sad statement, I think. They went back to the second house where Shashag, I can't pronounce it. But anyway, they went to a second house where this particular person had custody over the concubines. So now just think about it. This young lady has lost her virginity with a 1 in whatever chance of being called back by the king again. And that's what they were hoping for, is to be called back. Well, I say that. The purpose of the first time with the king was to see if he wanted to invite him back. And again, what is worse is that she has forfeited all pleasures and privileges of normal womanhood moving forward. Verse 15, I think, is interesting. Was Esther held against her will in a way that she was defiant, or did it appear that she was okay with what was going on? Read 15 again, Brian, would you?
Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her.
You take a look at Vashti, the queen from 4 years earlier, that refused to do what the king told her to do. And then we have Esther, who hid her Jewish origin as one of the chosen in order that her hope of becoming a queen might be a reality. Esther knew she was in a beauty contest, and to be totally blatant, it was the bedroom that would be the deciding factor. So I'm certainly not able to tell you what was in her mind, nor did I choose to try to do so. But we'd have to wonder a little bit. Any comments on that? Anybody? 16 and 17, Brian.
So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti.
I think it's interesting in verse 16 where it says that he loved her more than the others. I don't know how many people decide. We don't know that how far in the number of women had come along. It appears that she was moved up the line quite a bit. So some of these women that had been taken from these parents' homes, these 127 provinces, possibly never had to go in and lay with the king, because it sounds like to me that the choice was made after he had opportunity to be with her, that the decision was fast and decisive, and she'd be the new queen. Again, as Jim pointed, this is God's providence at work. Here we have an humble Jewish orphan raised by a relative, and that would be the wife of one of the most powerful monarchs on earth. This empire at this time made up more than half of the entire world at the time. And she was going to be the queen. Think about that. God's providence. Anything else through 17? Just 18 by itself, Brian.
Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty.
The King James Version says made a release, and most people that I read, I didn't understand what that meant, but what I read is that most likely he offered them a relief from their taxes for a given time. That's what historians think that word may have meant. But regardless, he was excited. He was happy that he had a queen, and he had a holiday just for that. 19 and 20, Brian.
And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care.
What does verse 19 mean? And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. I'm asking, does anybody have an idea what does it mean the second time? Does that mean he had a second round of virgins? I don't think so. He'd already selected a queen, unless he was doing it just because he could and because of lust. But anybody have any idea what that means? Second time? Let me get a mic to you, just 1 second.
I don't know that it's correct, but I always took that to mean that they brought everybody together to say, okay, I've chosen Esther.
Okay, that's certainly a thought, good thought. Okay, we'll go with that. I think that makes sense to me. Verse 20, we see the respect that she had for Mordecai, but also we see the human nature of persons. She was protecting herself because she was a Jew. 21 through 23.
In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. In 23 also.
Please.
Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence.
So it just happened that Mordecai was just at the right place to hear this conversation between these two men, right? Of course, it's God's providence. Where he talked about the size of the palace earlier, 80-something thousand square feet. I mean, it's a huge area. And for Mordecai to be in the presence of these two men that were talking about taking advantage and murdering their king had to be nothing more than the providence of God. So what does he do? He goes to who? Goes to Esther. Do you think that might have won her a little bit, even more closeness to the king? Because Mordecai had gone to her and said, this is what's going to happen. Then they went and they made sure that these accusations were correct. They were, and then what happened? Isn't that a sweet sound? Everybody's looking up that way. Isn't that a great sound? That's a great sound. Jim.
The culprits were hanged on the gallows. And the thing that I'm interested about here is the tradition that took place at this time is when something happened that the king liked, he liked to throw a banquet, a party for her and announce. And you'll see these banquets happen throughout this book. Some of them are good and some of them are not so good.
Right. Yeah, we're going to talk about one in particular, aren't we? For sure, this book. Yes, Wayne.
One thing to, keep in mind too is that, if these people were, plotting against the king, they weren't going to stop with just the king, So you can see why Mordecai would be interested because they would probably have, killed Esther as well and, anyone, closely associated with the king at that time.
Okay. Good point. Back at you, Jim.
I've already mentioned Joseph, but just look at the similarities of what happened in Joseph's situation and what's happening here with Esther. Those people, the two servants that were in prison when Joseph was, and he revealed their dreams, and one of them was put back in honor to be used later on to tell the king about Joseph that he knew. And the other servant was also punished by death too. So you've got several similarities here. God's providence and how they work in the lives of Joseph and Esther.
Okay, very good. Yes, ma'am.
Studying this chapter, it's really struck me about Esther, her humble spirit. She obeyed Mordecai and did what he told her, and she wasn't grasping, wanting the best.
I'm sorry, can y'all hear her? Is the mic working? Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
She wasn't grasping, wanting the best place in the harem. Her personality and her sweet spirit gained her what she gained. And even when she was going to go into the king, she submitted herself to the one who was in charge of her because she knew he would know best. But she had a sweet and humble spirit, and that's why everybody loved her as well as her beauty.
Right.
She was beautiful inside.
Right, very good. Do we have any idea how old she was? Anybody? Okay. Chapter 3, we're moving along. Chapter 3. Read verses 1 and 2, Brian.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage.
Okay, now we got another character coming into play, and he's going to be a major one. His name is what? Haman. We're going to read a lot about Haman in the next few chapters. We're going to find out that his desire was selfish. He had nothing more in his life to do than to try to escalate himself to a higher position. What's interesting is he was a descendant of King Agag, what was the king that failed to kill him after being instructed to do so? King Saul. He was given very clear instruction. If Saul had obeyed, there would have been no Haman. At least Haman would not have been in the picture. Verses 3 and 4.
Then the king's servants, who were at the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew.
Mordecai is pretty gutsy, isn't he? Who's another Old Testament character you reminded of that wouldn't bow? Who?
Daniel.
Yep, Daniel. He refused to bow as well, and Mordecai is standing his ground. It seems from the text that these people continued to encourage him to obey the king and to bow. And verse 3 says they spoke to him about it how often? It says daily. And he just would not adhere to it. Not sure why he let them know he was a Jew, since he had so directly told Esther to hide this fact, but he certainly did. And if you would, read verses 5 and 6, Brian, and then when we have our discussion, turn to Proverbs chapter 6. Right now, verses 5 and 6, please.
When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus.
Okay, let's back up just a little bit. And let's remember who this man is, Haman, why he feels like he has this power. In verse 1, it says he was advanced, and he was set above all the princes that were with him. So he had a very high position. Obviously high enough that he could command and tell these people that you are to bow to me or suffer the consequences. And when Mordecai, of course, refused to do so, then that's when the foolish pride of Haman's caused the anger to the point where he would do whatever he could to destroy Mordecai. His anger would not only be against Mordecai, but the entire nation where Mordecai came from. He was ready to launch his plan, but he needed to get approval from the king, and his plan was to do what? Anybody? What was his plan? Kill the Jews. Not just because Mordecai didn't bow, that was enough to say, look at these people. Who do they think they are? And his plan was to have all of them found and killed. Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, Brian.
Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. There are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers.
That pretty well describes Haman, doesn't it? The things that God hates. Anything else through verse 6? 7 through 11, Brian.
In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month, until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. You said through 8, I'm sorry. 7 and 8?
Through 11.
Oh, I'm sorry, 11.
Okay.
Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please."
So obviously Haman had a very good relationship with the king. It appears that whatever Haman said, the king seemed to be wanting to go along with it without getting proof. What's the accusation that Haman makes in verse 8 about the Jews? Why should they be destroyed? They don't keep the king's laws, king. I want you to know there's people out here that do that. Mordecai is the one that got the ball rolling down the hill, but it's also now it's all the Jewish people that Haman chooses to want to kill. And that's going to be his demise before it's over with, as anybody that's already read this book fully knows. At this point, Esther would have been queen for about 5 years. So she would have already built probably a good relationship with the king, all his servants, anybody that was in the, in the palace, she probably knew them. What were they casting lots for? So they cast lots, and it gave a bunch of dates here. They were casting lots to determine what month and day they were going to annihilate the Jews. And the lot fell, and that's when it would be done. So far, it appears the king is not aware of this plan. When the day was settled, then Haman went to the king to gain his backing. So kind of gutsy on Haman's part, wasn't it, to do that? But that was what they were cast for, was to find out the day that they were to annihilate the Jews. In verse 8, note that Haman did not mention the name of the nation. He says what? He doesn't say the Jewish people, he says a certain nation. And I think the reason he does that, I don't know the reason for sure, but you have to wonder if he wanted to keep that from the king, that it was the Jewish people. He painted the picture of a class of people who ignored the law of the Medes and Persians and lived under their own laws. Jim, you got a comment? Okay, we'll come back. Go ahead. We'll do that and I'll get back, finish up.
Go back to verse 7 about that.
Read it, Jim.
Said, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast, and the month of Adar was chosen. Keep in mind later on, it'll bring out this, but this, when everything ultimately happens, they had a feast or remembrance of it.
We got that coming.
Purim, P-U-R-I-M.
Yeah, you're
And
a little ahead of me.
it comes from this
Correct.
word right here.
Right. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Feast of Purim probably next week. Anybody else? All right, verse 9, we kind of finish up here. Remember that the treasury was probably depleted because of the expensive war with Greece. Haman is basically stating it wouldn't cost the government anything to do it. He's saying the amount that he promised to place in the treasury of his own money to annihilate the Jews was a large sum of money. You wonder if Haman presumed that the king would say no to the offer of money since it's a very large amount. But Haman he hated the Jews so much that he was willing to, out of his own pocket, fund the destruction of these people. What's the purpose of the signet ring? The signet ring was used to authorize decrees. The signature of the king was carved into the set of the ring, and it was then stamped on the decree to show it was authentic. So he had a signet on his ring. He'd probably wet it somehow, get some type of ink on it, place it on something, and that would say this was the king's order. By handing over the ring, he agreed that he was willing to do this. It was used to validate the paperwork we see in verse 12. Haman had personal hatred toward Jews. Remember, he was certainly not a Jew. And then verse 11, read 11 one more time, Brian.
And the king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please."
So the king said, "No, you keep your money. We'll use government funds to fund this venture." All that King knew at this point is that Haman said, you have a bunch of people out here that are rebellious, and he wanted to protect his kingdom. And that's why the money he's willing to spend it. Haman knew that the king loved Esther and that she was a Jew, and yet he moved forward with the king's permission. I just read that, didn't I? We'll cover that next time. Let's just disregard that last Timothy. I don't know that that's the case. Thank you.